Let's dive right into the fascinating world of autistic communication. But, and you know this is a deep dive, we are taking a critical lens today.
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to uncover.
We're going deep into an article from the outside, The Misguided Framing of Autism.
Ah, yes. It's a thought-provoking critique on a recent study, and the author, Jamie Horrocks, is an autistic GLP researcher.
And they bring such an important perspective to this. So, to set the stage for our listeners, the study Horrocks is dissecting is called Distinct Social Behavior and Interbrain Connectivity in Dyads with Autistic Individuals.
From the title alone, it makes you wonder what direction they're going in, right?
Right. And that's where this gets really interesting because Horrocks' main critique is that the study's whole framing is based on ableist assumptions. They even say, and I'm quoting here, the study's framing is deeply rooted in ableist assumptions, particularly around the hierarchical leader-follower dynamic so prevalent in the neuromajority.
It's this very traditional view of what's considered successful social interaction.
Like, if you're not aiming to be the leader, then what are you even doing, right?
Exactly. And so they're suggesting that autistic individuals who don't naturally fall into that leader role are somehow lacking.
Instead of trying to understand autistic communication on its own terms.
Yes. And this is where Horrocks brings in a really important concept: egalitarian communication.
So help us understand, what is that exactly?
It's like, instead of a hierarchy, imagine a web where everyone's input is valued equally.
More collaborative.
Much more. Horrocks uses terms like metristic to describe this kind of communication, challenging that default assumption that we're all striving for the same kind of leadership.
So it's not about deficits, but differences.
Exactly. It's like judging a fish on its ability to climb a tree. You're totally missing the point.
Love that analogy. It makes me think about these two key aspects of autism that Horrocks says the study completely missed: alexithymia and gestalt processing.
Right, and you can't talk about autistic communication without considering those.
I mean, we have to talk about how huge of an oversight that is.
Absolutely. So in the simplest terms, alexithymia is basically having trouble identifying and expressing your emotions.
And Horrocks points out that it's present in a staggering 80% of autistic people.
80%. It blows my mind that the researchers missed something so fundamental, especially in a study about social interaction.
Right. How can you analyze someone's ability to connect socially without considering the role of emotional processing, particularly when such a high percentage of your participants experience it differently?
It just doesn't make sense. You're missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Horrocks even mentions, being alexithymic themselves, that they see the study's conclusions as just completely inaccurate in terms of how autistic people actually navigate emotions.
Totally. And then on top of that, you have gestalt processing, which the study also ignores.
Which, for our listeners who aren't familiar, it's a way of processing information where you see the whole picture instead of just individual details. Right?
Exactly. Like, imagine seeing the entire forest instead of just focusing on separate trees.
It's a completely different way of experiencing things.
Exactly. And it can have a huge impact on how someone communicates and interacts socially.
It's like, in social situations, neurotypical people often pick up on all these subtle cues, these unspoken rules, without even realizing it.
Right. It's like second nature.
But for someone who processes information more holistically, those subtle signals might not carry the same weight, right?
Precisely. They're not paying attention. They're just focused on the bigger picture, the overall meaning. It's not a deficit. It's just a different way of seeing things.
It really makes you realize how much our assumptions shape the way we interpret things, especially when it comes to something as complex as communication.
And it makes you question, the ethics of it all.
Especially when you consider the lack of autistic representation on the research team.
A critical oversight for sure.
I mean, it's like you're studying a group of people, but you haven't even bothered to include anyone from that group in the process of designing the study itself,
Right? It just baffles me. And Horrocks points this out too. It's like, how could this study get approved by an IRB with such glaring flaws?
You've got to wonder if the autistic participants were truly able to give informed consent.
Exactly. Were they fully aware that their natural ways of interacting were being analyzed through this lens that automatically labeled certain things as deficient? It raises a lot of ethical concerns about how autism research has been conducted.
For sure. And I think that's what makes Horrocks' perspective so important here. They're calling out those deeply ingrained biases that often make their way into traditional research models.
Absolutely. And one of those assumptions that often comes up is this idea of the double empathy problem.
I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure I understand it.
Yeah, it can be a bit tricky. So the way it's traditionally understood is that autistic and non-autistic people both struggle to understand each other equally. Like there's this mutual communication gap.
Okay, so it's not just that autistic people have trouble understanding non-autistic people, but it goes both ways.
Right. And while it might seem like a step forward from just blaming autistic people for communication breakdowns, it still misses a really crucial point.
Which is?
Hurwitz points out that autistic people can and do communicate very effectively with each other.
They do.
They understand each other's nuances, their humor, the ways they express their emotions. It's often when you bring neurotypical people into the mix that the communication breaks down.
So the problem isn't necessarily a lack of empathy on both sides, but more of a lack of understanding, of effort, from neurotypical people to meet autistic people halfway to adapt to different communication styles.
Precisely. And that's a really important distinction to make because it shifts the responsibility.
From the autistic person to the person who maybe hasn't expanded their own ways of communicating and connecting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that communication isn't one size fits all. We need to be more flexible.
It's like that fish and tree analogy again. We wouldn't judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, so why are we judging autistic people on their ability to communicate like neurotypical people?
It's about appreciating those differences, right?
Exactly. And this is where Hurwitz's call for alternative frameworks in autism research is so important.
Oh, absolutely. Moving away from those deficit-based models and really embracing the diversity of human experience is key.
So what would research look like if it were designed with these alternative frameworks, these more egalitarian and neurodiverse social models in mind?
Imagine a study where, instead of trying to fit autistic people into these predetermined roles like leader or follower, researchers just observe how autistic people naturally interact with each other.
Paying attention to their strengths, their unique ways of communicating and connecting.
Exactly. Things like nonverbal cues, shared interests, sensory experiences, all these things that might be overlooked or misinterpreted through a neurotypical lens.
Because there are so many different ways to communicate effectively, right?
Right. It's not just one way. And that's why Horrocks emphasizes the importance of autistic representation in research.
Oh, absolutely. You need people with that lived experience to guide the research questions, the methods, everything.
Because who better to understand the intricacies of autism than autistic people themselves?
Exactly. So instead of viewing autistic communication as a problem that needs to be fixed, we can start to appreciate it as this unique and valuable way of experiencing the world.
Absolutely. Because it is valuable.
This is really making me rethink my own assumptions about communication.
It's a journey, isn't it?
It really is. And I think Horrocks sums it up beautifully when they say, and I'm quoting here, researchers must stop pathologizing the differences between autistic and neuromajority communication and instead embrace the diversity of neurodiverse social models.
It's a powerful statement and it's a call to action. Not just for researchers and clinicians, but for all of us.
And it's about shifting that whole perspective, isn't it? It's about moving away from that limited view of what's considered normal and embracing the full spectrum of human interaction.
Absolutely, and that's what makes Horrocks' critique so vital. It goes beyond just this one study. It really pushes us to rethink our assumptions about autism and neurodiversity in general.
Yeah, to move away from those deficit-based models and really start to appreciate the unique strengths and perspectives that autistic individuals bring to the table.
Exactly. It's not a deficit. It's just different, and it has its own value. It's about understanding that communication isn't just about words.
Right. There's so much more to it than that.
It's about connection and understanding and respecting each other's differences.
It's about creating a space for those differences to thrive, without judgment or the pressure to conform.
Beautifully said.
Yeah,
Because ultimately, isn't that what true communication's all about?
it really is, and it's something I think we can all work on. So as we wrap up this deep dive into autistic communication, I want to leave you with this. What does authentic communication look like in your own life?
That's a good one.
How can you challenge your own biases and create more inclusive and meaningful connections with the people around you?
That's a powerful question to end on.
It is, because it makes you really think, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It reminds us that this conversation isn't just about autism. It's about how we as human beings can communicate and connect with each other in more empathetic and meaningful ways.
In all our beautiful, diverse ways.
Exactly.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.